Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, BethChatsBooks. Now today's video is going to be my July wrap up. Now I know we're officially not out of July yet, but if you've watched any of my videos over the past couple of weeks, you'll know I keep banging on about the fact that I'm going to be leaving the country at the end of July, which now is merely days away. So I have had to kind of distort the months for me so that I can give you everything that I can possibly squeeze in and not miss a month. So if I do the July wrap up now, then I can give you an August TBR pretty soon after, and that way I'm on top of every month. So when I come back in September, I can give you the August wrap up, pump out the September TBR and keep going. So at the moment I've only read 3 books. I decided to cut the whole 5 books short and do 3 books this month, tag the other 2 onto August and make August bigger because obviously I'm away for all of August and a little bit of September, and you will be able to see the August wrap up in September. That will be happening, but for now I thought I would class this as a triple book review / my July wrap up. So I'm just going to get straight stuck in with the triple book review. So the first one I read in the month of July, sorry I just had to stretch over there, I've left them far away, is Little Nothing by Marissa Silver. Now I mentioned this, I think in the July TBR, I think I extended this all the way from June and I did finish it in July. And this was quite an interesting one. Everybody kind of raved about this. Again, I'm going to exhaust myself saying this, but this was in Mercedes' MothBox subscription service for March. Oh yeah, finally got that out, and that's the last time I'm going to discuss it, but I'm going to link it down below if you're interested. But this was not what I expected. It has elements of a lot of fantasy in it. This was a slight disappointment in some ways because I kind of went into it and for the first half of it I was really intrigued. It goes through a lot of fairy tales and folklore and different bits and bats, but then it started trailing off for me into elements of folk tales and fairy stories that maybe I wasn't comfortable with. I'm not overly well versed in fairy tales and folk tales and magical realism in general. So there was elements where these shift and take animal form. There's a lot of circus elements in here. There's tragedy. There's 3 main plot point developments that kind of link a selection of characters together, but they're shifting and changing and the environment around them is changing, and I think it took me some getting used to. Now that I've finished reading it and I take a bit of time to reflect, I actually did enjoy it, but I enjoyed the main story better, which is where the character, oh I've forgotten her name, Pavla. It talks about when she's born, and she was born to aging parents and she's born a dwarf, and how the community try and deal with that. I was really hooked and interested in that story. But then the story develops into wolves and circus freaks, and I'm not going to give too much away, but I was so much more interested in Pavla's beginning than her development, and I would have happily read a book more on that. But I think the way that this book is set up is that the stories exhaust themselves and you have to move forward. So I'm not going to give any spoilers so that people can go out and just get it and read it if they want. But if you're interested in fairy tales, folklore, things that are a little bit strange, dwarves, circus, some bizarre elements, then this will definitely be for you. I think because I was hooked in the first story, the rest seemed a bit of a disappointment, but it did make me realise after reflecting that I did enjoy some elements of this and I should get back on the magical realism horse and see what else is out there. This is very well put together. I could read this with the cover on. I know a lot of people take the dust jacket off, but I could happily read it with the dust jacket on. A full reading, and there's not any kind of wear and tear, so it's well put together. And if you're interested in that kind of storyline, you should go check it out, and I'll link it down below. And then the next one I read in the month of July was Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. Now this was a really interesting one for me because I really wanted to enjoy this, and I felt oddly surprised, but in a weird way. This was not what I expected it to be, and I did have some issues with this. It follows Antoinette in this, and it follows Mr. Rochester, who was in Jane Eyre. This is kind of a prequel to it, and he goes and finds her. But what I didn't expect is this is cut into 3 parts, and the 3 parts aren't connected, so they're almost disjointed 3 parts, which massive chunks of what actually happened has disappeared. So you have to piece together what you want from it. Everything is very subtle in this book, so you're kind of led to the ending to believe that Mr. Rochester is a horrible man. It's implied that he's been very physically abusive to her and that he's had an affair with one of her black maids. But what was more interesting in this than that kind of storyline was that it goes into how post-slavery in Jamaica, how race is kind of turned on its head and the white people are seen as inferior, because Mr. Rochester and Antoinette are both white, but she's a white Creole, so she's worse, because in this, if you're an Englishman coming over, you have more power than if you are a white person who's tried to initiate slavery and then has kind of been left behind in Jamaica. There's kind of this confusion over the hierarchy of race in this. Mr. Rochester and his relationship with Antoinette is reflected in this wider confusion about colonialism and everybody's place in Jamaica. There's loads of really interesting elements and it's very multi-layered. However, what I really benefited from was reading this particular copy, which is a Penguin Classics copy, which I'll link down below, because it had, inside it had an introduction, if you can see, notes on the text, and then a little bit at the end. So I kind of had a scholarly guide all the way through it, and I think a lot of people who read this at school got the most out of it because they could dissect it and the teachers could explain bits to you. So I would recommend that if you are reading this as a new time reader who's never read it for high school or A-level, that you try and get some kind of guide with it, just so that some of these obvious things that if they were put in context you'd understand, or potentially some of the thick kind of layered elements to this you can actually glean out of it, because as a first time reader you don't get as much out of it as you would want. So I had to read some of the scholarly bits. I also would think I'll have to reread it to get the most out of it, so don't be disheartened if you read this and think I really didn't get as much out of it as I should have done. So that's what I would recommend. I gave this 3 out of 5 stars because on reflection I actually enjoyed it a lot more than the experience of reading it. The experience of reading it was difficult because you'd get to the end of a section and it would jump right into a different part. So we barely meet Mr. Rochester in the first bit, it kind of goes through her childhood, and then the second bit they're married, you know, and we haven't got any development of how they met each other, and then things come out the woodworks as you read further on that would have been more useful if they'd been told earlier on and things like that. So I only gave it 3.5, but I think if I reread it and appreciate it more with a second reread, it could have potentially got higher because I did enjoy the story. Before I move on to the final book, I just remembered that I didn't actually tell you what I gave this one. So I gave this one, I think, 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this, but some bits were irritating for me, and I don't think I could have given it the full 5 stars because I would have preferred the main plot line. But I think this was a lot more enjoyable, an easier read, a refreshing read than this one. So what I would recommend if you're just trying to get back on the reading horse, this one would be good fun for you. And if you want to challenge yourself, this one would be for you, but I wouldn't start with this one. It seems less intimidating because it's smaller, but it's packed and it's also quite dated now. So this needs your attention and this one could be quite a passive read. So there we go. And then finally on to the last one after I've just messed all that up. The final book I read, which I just finished last night actually, was The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss. Now this has been going around BookTube. Jen over at Jen Campbell adores this, and a lot of other people raved about this. So many book channels that I'm not going to link them all down below. I was reading quite a lot of reviews on it last night because when I finished it I didn't know how to feel because I had a very high expectation for this, and then sometimes when you have such a high expectation it can ruin your reading. Luckily it didn't ruin my reading. However, I did have a few small niggles with this book, and that was mainly coming from Adam's narration. So Adam is the dad of Miriam, who's on the front cover, or is meant to be on the front cover. And Miriam, one day her heart suddenly stops on the sports field. She's a 15-year-old girl, and her father is a stay-at-home dad who has a PhD, who kind of, I think, is feeling emasculated by the fact that he can't provide for his family, that his academic career hasn't gone off the way he wanted. His wife, Emma, is a nurse at the NHS and she's really struggling. She barely gets the hours to come home and see her children. And I think she suffers a little bit with the guilt of when Mariam's kind of diagnosed with this anaphylactic, exercise-induced illness. It's all very vague. I think she feels a bit guilty, but it's all from Adam's narration. The only things that I didn't like about some of his narration was that it was overly sentimental at points. I think he wanted to profess his intelligence all the way through it to make big metaphorical statements, or to do the bathos in this where he's discussing bigger, wider things while looking at something simplistic. And so there was some kind of romantic elements in there that I just cringed a little bit at, only because I don't love overly sentimental books. Some bits in here are beautifully phrased and some things are perfect, because there's some passages you read that almost make you go because they're very sad and they're very true, and they're very hard to stomach when you read them. So I think that the romantic elements tried to peter this out so that it wasn't overly depressing. But apart from those little niggles, it was a faultless book for me. I love books like this where it doesn't have a plot development, it's just the discussion of family dynamics and relationships. And while it seems that the main plot is about the fear over her future, I think actually it goes into the wider discussion of how parents, how do you let go of your children and let them develop into adulthood. And it's also Adam registering where his relationship with Emma is, where his future is, and where he's going to find his happiness at the end. So the only little niggle at the end was just kind of the cliche last line, which I'll just read it to you because it was one of those lines that I just thought, why? Which I do have little niggles like this. I'll just read you the last passage. So, stories have endings, that's why we tell them, for reassurance that there is meaning in our lives. But like a diagnosis, a story can become a prison, a straight road mapped out by the people who went before. Stories are not the truth. Begin with brokenness, begin again. We are not only the characters written by our ancestors. I have told my stories now, and we are still here, and the day is hardly begun. So I didn't just like that cliche at the end, and the day's only begun and we can make it what it is, because I thought Sarah Moss didn't need to drop that cliche line at the end, the day's just begun. I think the beautiful prose spoke for themselves, but there's lots of beautiful prose in here like that. It's beautifully written. It doesn't promise you too much, it just discusses where these characters are at. It reminded me a little bit of Ian McEwan's writing style, particularly in Saturday that I read. It's more about the family coming to terms with things than the wider other story that it tries to present. I recommend it to parents because I think you would feel a lot reading this. It would make you think of your own children and your relationship with them through their teenage years. I think teenagers and young adults should read it. I think it was a fantastic book, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars, so this was my highest read this month. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So I hope you enjoyed that mini book review. I know it was a little bit messy because I'd forgotten what I'd reviewed everything, but if you're interested in any of those books, I'll link them all down below. I would love to know what you guys are reading in July, so link down below with what your favourite reads are, whether you'd be interested in any of them, whether you've read any of them, or you like them or love them, or you think my review on them was total rubbish. I'd love to hear from you about that. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your July, and I'll see you all very soon.